Life in the countryside was far from easy. Margaret and Robert Langley were hard-working people who kept a large farmstead and barely had a minute to themselves. They had a daughter, Emily, a quiet little girl left mostly to her own devices. Margaret spent her days in the vegetable garden and tending the livestock, while Robert worked part-time on a nearby farm, repairing agricultural machinery. Emily, like wild grass in an open field, grew up alone. Roaming freely with no one to guide or watch over her. The girl longed for warmth, for someone to truly see her. But her mother would always send her to her father, and her father in turn would redirect her to her mother, not wanting her underfoot. She felt like a burden. Her days were identical, grey, and painfully uneventful. Her parents worked without rest, without weekends, without time for her. But if a child is unwanted by their own parents, could someone else be watching? Emily stared sadly at the picture she had drawn, a bright, colourful portrait of her family, one that neither Mom nor Dad seemed to care about. She had tried so hard. Suddenly she felt as though someone was observing her from behind a nearby tree. Someone interested. Children always search for those who see them. It's understandable. Parents are busy. Life is hard. But a child cannot grasp why milking a cow is more important than their drawing. Maybe, once grown up, they understand. But in childhood, we all want one thing: to be loved, noticed, and cherished. Emily was simply reaching out for warmth. One day she showed her mother a new toy, an old-fashioned plush teddy bear. None of the neighbour kids had anything like it. The bear looked odd, faded, almost gloomy. But Emily adored it. She said it was a gift from the forest grandma. Margaret, as usual, only half listened. She assumed that Helen, Robert's mother from the neighbouring village, had brought the toy during her last visit. But as time passed, Margaret began noticing strange changes in her daughter. Emily wouldn't let the bear out of her hands. She stopped playing with other kids, grew quiet, withdrawn. She spent hours alone in her room, whispering softly to the stuffed animal. Her mother grew increasingly disturbed by her daughter's behaviour. One day, Margaret saw a neighbour boy shove Emily hard. She stumbled and scraped both knees, blood running down her legs. But Emily didn't react, not a flinch. It was as if she didn't feel pain at all. Margaret was deeply unsettled. And soon other children began avoiding Emily. They whispered that something about her wasn't right. When a child becomes unusually attached to an object, especially one given by someone mysterious, it's worth paying attention. There are beliefs, even among skeptics, that an object can serve as a vessel for energy exchange. Some call it a binding gift, or in folklore, a token that takes more than it gives. In Emily's case, the teddy bear may have been more than just a toy. It became her closest companion, the only one she trusted, and the deeper this bond grew, the further Emily drifted from reality. She began spending more and more time in imaginary worlds, replaying stories in her mind. Her emotions dulled. Her face became blank. Whatever energy she once gave to the outside world, to her parents, to friends, was now locked away inside. But Margaret was too overwhelmed by daily chores to ask her daughter what was happening. She didn't notice how far Emily had already gone. One afternoon, Emily came into the kitchen and quietly asked if she could visit Grandma Helen. Margaret replied that they'd all go together next week, but Emily kept insisting. Eventually, her mother gave in, allowing her to visit the neighbouring village, but only if Robert went with her. Then, as suddenly as she had asked, Emily disappeared. Margaret happened to glance at the clock. It was exactly 11 a.m. Robert and Emily had left together hours ago, but her unease only grew. Emily had changed lately. She didn't draw any more. She no longer asked questions, and she clung to that strange teddy bear as if it were part of her own body. Margaret's anxious thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Helen, the very grandmother Emily claimed to be visiting. Margaret's stomach dropped. Helen looked confused. "No one came to see me today," she said, "and I haven't seen Emily in weeks. I never gave her a toy." Moments later, Robert returned, alone. He looked shaken. Emily was no longer with him. He had assumed she'd stayed behind with her mother. They had each thought she was with the other. Panic set in. Their daughter was gone, and no one knew where she was. While the adults argued, panicking over where to begin the search, Emily quietly walked through the front door, calm, unfazed, as if nothing had happened. Relief washed over Margaret like a tidal wave. Thank God she was safe. But when asked where she had been, Emily answered in a flat, almost distant voice. "I was with Grandma," she said. "Grandma Helen?" Margaret asked. "No, the other one, the forest grandma, the one who gave me the bear." Emily then began to describe her visit, her voice eerily calm. She had been alone again, bored, with nothing to do. She tried drawing, then got tired of that. Kicking a ball wasn't fun either. So she invented a new game. She closed her eyes tightly and spun in circles, again and again, until the world blurred and swirled around her like a dream. Then, still laughing, she skipped forward, eyes shut, letting her feet take her somewhere, anywhere. When she opened her eyes, she was deep in the forest. That's where she met her new friend, an old woman dressed beautifully, like a fairy tale character. Her voice was kind, her smile warm. She asked Emily for help carrying a basket of herbs to her little house by the lake. It sounded like an adventure, exactly what Emily had been dreaming of. So she went with her. The woman's home looked like something from a picture book, cozy, magical. Emily had never seen anything like it. It was the kind of place where dreams live. The forest grandmother let her rest on a bench, and in gratitude for helping, gave her the teddy bear. She also whispered that, very soon, Emily could come live there forever. Emily was overjoyed. No one had given her a gift in so long. She didn't know what kind of hands she had fallen into. Of course, the adults didn't take the story seriously. Helen, the real grandmother, assumed Emily's imagination had simply run wild. Robert, ever sceptical, thought she was flat out lying. Only Margaret felt something was deeply, truly wrong. She couldn't explain it, but every instinct screamed that this wasn't a child's fantasy. It was something darker. Some experts say children are unusually sensitive, capable of channeling energies, or even attracting spirits. Sometimes a child isn't just the recipient of a presence, they become a conduit, especially when the connection is emotional, vulnerable, like Emily's was. There's also an old belief, if an object is used often enough, loved deeply enough, it becomes something more. A vessel, a tether. The teddy bear in this case might have been such a thing, charged with a force Emily was too young to understand. Perhaps this forest grandmother wasn't a kind old woman at all. Perhaps she had once lost a daughter, and now she needed a replacement. She lured Emily with kindness, attention, gifts, everything the girl lacked at home. But her true purpose was far more disturbing. She was trying to use the child as a host. She wanted her own daughter's spirit to live again, inside Emily. And Emily? She didn't resist. She didn't even notice. Under the old woman's influence, the child had become numb, detached, like someone under hypnosis. Her mind wasn't her own anymore. One could say the woman had stolen Emily's soul, not with violence but with kindness. She stole it with games, stories, warmth, everything a lonely child craves. And that's why Emily followed her so easily, into the woods, into the dream, into the trap. That night, Margaret had a nightmare. In the dream, Emily was walking into a dark, twisted forest, clutching the teddy bear, her face expressionless, eyes empty. She moved like a sleepwalker hypnotized. With every step, she held the bear tighter. The deeper she went into the woods, the darker everything became. Margaret felt something cold and wet spread through her chest. Not just fear, but dread, the kind that coils in your stomach like a snake. In the dream, lightning flashed, and for a brief second Margaret saw her daughter, standing outside, pounding on a window, screaming for help. Behind her, the teddy bear. Only it wasn't a toy anymore. Its eyes moved, its mouth twisted. It watched her. Margaret woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of thunder still echoing in her ears. Her skin felt clammy. Her heart raced. It took her a few seconds to realize she was still in her bed. Was it just a dream? She jumped to her feet and rushed to Emily's room. Her daughter was there, asleep, curled up under the blanket, the bear nestled tightly in her arms. But something felt off. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the Emily in that bed wasn't fully there anymore. She couldn't explain it. But the connection between mother and child runs deeper than logic. On some level, Margaret knew her daughter was in danger. The bear was the key, and the danger was growing. The next morning, Margaret awoke with a heavy feeling in her chest, the dream still lingering like smoke. She rushed to Emily's room. It was empty. The bed was cold. Emily was gone. Robert hadn't seen her either. Panic erupted inside Margaret like a firestorm. This time it was real. No dream, no illusion. Their daughter had vanished again without a trace. They ran through the village, knocking on doors, asking neighbours. No one had seen Emily. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Fear turned to terror. Margaret felt her heart twisting in her chest. She knew, if they didn't find her today, they might never find her again. The local officer was called in, but offered little hope. "We'll search the area," he said, "but these things take time." Time was exactly what they didn't have. No one knew where to begin, no one except Margaret. Something deep inside her pointed toward the woods. Her mind said no. It was irrational, dangerous, but her heart screamed louder. She closed her eyes and let instinct take over, and somehow it led her. She walked blindly through thick trees and tangled roots, drawn by something primal, something ancient. It wasn't logic, it wasn't reason, it was a mother's sense. Then, just like in her dream, she saw it. A crooked little house, hidden in the trees, the one Emily had described. Her daughter had called it magical. But standing before it now, Margaret saw the truth. It was straight out of a nightmare. Emily stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale, her eyes distant, like someone under a spell. Beside her was the old woman. But this was no kindly forest grandmother. Up close, her face seemed to shift like smoke, one moment sweet, the next. Something inhuman. Margaret called out to her daughter. No response. She screamed. Emily didn't even blink. The woman smiled. Margaret tried to run to her, but some invisible force, thick like the air itself, had turned to glue, held her back. The forest pulsed with something dark and ancient. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then she saw it, the bear, still in Emily's arms, still watching. And somehow Margaret knew. That thing is the anchor. That's how she's holding on to my child. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed the nearest rock, but it slipped from her fingers. Then she saw a sharp gardening knife still tucked in her coat from earlier that morning. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up. She lunged forward and stabbed the teddy bear. It made no sound, but the moment the blade pierced the fabric, a gust of wind howled through the trees like a scream. The air cracked. The ground trembled. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping as if waking from a nightmare. Her eyes cleared. She looked around, confused, and then saw her mother. "Mom!" Margaret ran to her and wrapped her arms around the child, sobbing. Behind them, the woman shrieked, her face twisted with rage. But she no longer had power. Without the bear, her hold was broken. She could do nothing now but watch, powerless, as mother and daughter ran from the clearing. And that was it. The spell was broken. Emily was safe. They never spoke to the police about what really happened. Who would believe them? Even Robert struggled to accept it. But Margaret knew. She had seen the truth, and she would never forget it. Emily, however, remembered nothing. Not the house, not the forest, not the woman, not even the bear. Some memories, especially those soaked in darkness, have a way of erasing themselves, as if the mind protects the soul from what it should never have seen. From that day forward, Margaret and Robert changed. The farm could wait. Chores could wait. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was more important than their daughter. Margaret's mother, Helen, began visiting more often, bringing books, treats, and warmth. Emily adored her, and this time, when she received a teddy bear, it was from someone real, someone who loved her. A gentle, smiling gift, not a curse in disguise. Finally, the house felt warm again. Emily laughed again, and the shadows stayed outside the windows where they belonged, for now. A little over a year ago, Victoria and Paul became husband and wife, but the fairy tale ended almost immediately. Marriage turned into a living nightmare. Victoria's once cheerful face faded into silence. The confident, radiant young woman who used to light up every room slowly withered under the weight of daily fear. Paul, who seemed so kind and attentive when they first met, revealed himself to be a cruel, violent man, a sadist, and emotionally unstable. He isolated her, controlled her, hurt her. She wore scarves to hide the bruises, like the one around her neck today. Paul had flown into a rage the night before, strangling her again. But guests were expected for dinner, and Paul insisted she smile and play the role of the perfect wife. No one was to know the truth. To the outside world, their marriage was to appear flawless. He demanded it. To colleagues and friends, Paul seemed like a charming, respectable husband, always polite, always well-dressed. No one suspected the monster he became behind closed doors. All his fury was reserved for Victoria, and he knew just how to twist the knife. He gaslit her, made her feel small, stupid, broken, convinced her that she was the problem, that every outburst was her fault. And eventually, she began to believe him. He broke her will completely. Victoria became his personal scapegoat, the one he could humiliate, berate, and beat without consequence. She obeyed everything he said, terrified of what would happen if she didn't. Somewhere along the way, she stopped fighting, stopped thinking. She just survived. Even their dinners with his co-workers felt like punishment. She had to smile, laugh on cue, pretend she was happy. It was exhausting, and no one knew. No one knew that she had no one to run to. Her mother had died when she was a child. She'd never met her father. There was no safety net, no backup plan, no one waiting on the other end of the phone. The only family she had was her grandmother, Clara, who lived in a quiet village far away. But Victoria hadn't told her anything. She kept everything hidden. Paul came home every day for lunch, and she had to have his food hot and ready. If she didn't, it always ended in violence. He would scream, throw things, raise his hand. She feared him, and quietly she hated him. How had she not seen it before? How had she once loved him? In just a few weeks after their wedding, the sweet and attentive man she had fallen for was gone, replaced by a tyrant. And the most terrifying part? There was no one to stop him. That day, Victoria felt the panic rise again. She was running behind. Paul would be home any minute, and the borscht wasn't done. Her heart pounded as she stirred the pot, hands trembling. She knew what would happen if he walked through the door and the table wasn't set. Suddenly, she paused. A strange feeling swept over her. She had the distinct sense that she wasn't alone, not in a creepy way, but in a way that made her glance over her shoulder. The hallway was empty, but still, something tugged at her instincts. She shook it off. "No time for ghosts," she muttered under her breath. "Get it together." Hallucinations were the last thing she needed. Still unsettled, Victoria stepped out of the kitchen for a moment, convinced she was just overtired. But when she returned just a few minutes later, her heart nearly stopped. The soup was finished. The kitchen, spotless. Everything was cleaned and in place. And on the table, in a small glass, sat a fresh white flower. Victoria froze. Paul didn't bring it. She was sure of that, and there was no one else in the apartment. No friends. No visitors. Her breath caught in her throat. Was someone helping her, or was she losing her mind? Paul returned earlier than expected. His footsteps echoed sharply through the apartment. Victoria flinched. She could already tell he was in a foul mood. She looked around. Everything was perfect. Nothing to scold her for, but that never stopped him before. She felt a chill. She needed someone, anyone, to protect her. But who? She had no one, not her mother, not her father. Even her grandmother had no idea what was really going on. She was alone. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice whispered, "Number not alone." Sometimes when people are pushed to their breaking point, when all the usual defenses are gone, the mind does something extraordinary. It creates a protector, a guardian, a part of the self that rises when no one else will. Paul's anger surged. He hovered behind her, eyes scanning, lips curling. Victoria, hands shaking, began ladling the soup into bowls. She prayed he wouldn't throw the pot, wouldn't grab her, wouldn't scream. Then, a crash. A loud, unmistakable crash from the hallway. Paul jerked his head toward the noise, confused. What the hell was that? No answer. They both stepped into the corridor. Nothing was broken, nothing was moved. But the air felt strange, charged like just before a storm. Victoria's skin tingled. Back in the kitchen, something even stranger had happened. One of the spoons had twisted, bent in half like soft wire, something no human hand could do. Paul's brow furrowed. Victoria stood frozen. Then her eyes caught something tucked inside the shoe cabinet. Another white flower. That night, for the first time in weeks, Paul didn't lay a hand on her. And the next morning, Victoria found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. But the peace didn't last. Paul's cruelty resumed like clockwork. He insulted her, accused her of imaginary affairs, slammed doors, broke dishes. Every day he found a new way to punish her, emotionally, physically, spiritually. Victoria endured it with clenched teeth and silent tears. But something had changed. Lately she began to feel the presence more clearly. Not just a chill in the air or a flicker in the corner of her eye, but a real sense of someone watching over her. She never saw it directly, but it left signs, small, gentle signs, and it never hurt her. She started finding flowers more often, little white blossoms left on her pillow, near the window, by her tea. And late at night, she would feel the brush of calm in her chest, like someone placing a warm hand on her shoulder. She should have been scared, but she wasn't. Because whatever this was, spirit, ghost, guardian, it wasn't here to harm her. It was here to protect her. One evening, Paul came home drunk and furious. Again, he accused Victoria of cheating, called her vile names, slammed his fist into the wall just inches from her head. Then he stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him with such force it shook the frame. Victoria was left alone, trembling, breath shallow, eyes darting from corner to corner. The apartment was a disaster, but for once she didn't clean, she didn't cry, she didn't move. She collapsed onto the couch and despite everything drifted off to sleep, and she dreamed. It was their wedding, the day that had once been the happiest of her life. She wore the gloves her grandmother had gifted her, delicate, lace-trimmed, handed down through generations. Paul looked dashing and kind, his arm around her waist, whispering promises of forever. Guests laughed. Champagne flowed. Victoria beamed. But then it changed. The dream twisted. Paul's smile faded, his face darkened, his voice rose into a yell. Rage burned in his eyes, and before the stunned crowd he grabbed her wrist, hard, too hard. She could feel the bones grinding beneath his fingers, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. He was going to kill her right there, in her wedding dress, in front of everyone. She woke up screaming and froze. The apartment was silent, immaculate, and surrounding her, scattered across the living room floor, were white roses. Dozens of them. Still shaken, Victoria sat up and tried to breathe. The dream had felt too real, too close. She rubbed her arms to shake the chill and wandered to the dresser. As she opened one of the drawers, her hand brushed against something soft. The gloves. The very same gloves she'd worn on her wedding day. A gift from her grandmother, passed down from woman to woman for over a century. She remembered how proud she'd felt slipping them on that morning, and how bitter the memory had become. She held them to her chest, overcome with emotion. Her mother hadn't been there that day, and now, wearing these gloves, Victoria missed her more than ever. But the moment was shattered. The front door slammed. Paul had returned. And he was drunk. The smell hit her before he even spoke, and when he did, it was the same old bile, accusations of betrayal, imaginary affairs, filth spewed through slurred words. But something was different this time. As he advanced toward her, yelling louder, veins bulging, the room shifted. The air thickened, and just as Paul raised his hand, a force knocked him backward, hard. He stumbled, shocked, eyes darting wildly. Victoria stood frozen, and then she saw it, flickering in the shadows behind her. A shape, faint, feminine, familiar. Her mother, Larissa. She wasn't gone. She had been there all along. Paul stared, disoriented, trying to understand what had just happened. but the more he raged, the less power he seemed to have. Larissa's presence grew stronger, not fully visible, just a shimmer, a pulse, a soft outline, but undeniable. She wasn't here to scare him. She wasn't here to reason with him. She was here to protect her daughter. For the first time in her life, Victoria felt what it meant to be truly defended, not with fists or shouting, but with something ancient, maternal and unbreakable. Paul turned pale, and then, without a word, he left, and never came back. The police searched, questioned Victoria, questioned her neighbours, but no one ever saw him again. He had vanished, like a shadow wiped from the earth. Victoria moved in with her grandmother Clara and finally shared everything: the abuse, the fear, the truth. Clara wept, because it was happening all over again. Larissa, Clara's daughter, had suffered the same fate. She had married a man who turned out to be violent and monstrous, and just like Victoria, she had stayed silent until it killed her. But Larissa didn't leave. Her spirit had remained, lingering near her daughter, powerless to act, until now. And when Victoria returned to the apartment one final time to collect her documents, her savings, her past, she found one last sign: the gloves, laid gently across a shelf, and beside them a single white flower. A goodbye, a blessing, a message. You are not alone anymore. Victoria stood in the quiet apartment, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from fear, not even from sadness, but from peace. Her mother hadn't been there in life, but in death, she became her guardian, forever.